For most of the Middle Ages, until the 16th century, great free cities, safe behind their walls, vied for political power in Europe, with feudal kings and nobles whose wealth came from their vast landholdings. By the 16th and 17th centuries, however, improvements in artillery meant that walls could no longer ensure the safety of cities. At this time, a new and rising class of merchants allied themselves with the kings and nobles. With money supplied by the merchants, kings and nobles could hire large armies, equip them with the latest weapons, and extend their control over more and more territory. By the 18th century, the most powerful of Europe's kings had created national states in which capitalist enterprise was flourishing. The glittering royal courts were supported by new bureaucracies as well as by military might. The wealth, glory, and power of these absolute monarchs was most lavishly displayed at Versailles, where the King of France held court. Here, the wealthy elite could buy privileges, ranging from lucrative offices to exemption from taxation. Perhaps more than elsewhere in Europe, France's king and capitalists had come to ignore the medieval Christian idea of community, which held that the privileged had responsibility for those at the bottom of the social order. The great mass of people were poor, while laboring endlessly to support the privileged. This was true of peasants toiling in the fields, burdened with royal taxes, and of city artisans and workers, jammed into slums whose rents enriched middle-class landlords.
Suddenly, in 1789, a revolution began that lasted 10 years and shattered the established social order in France. First, a National Assembly met and refused to disperse until a constitution had been written. Then a mob overran one of the king's great prison fortresses and took control of Paris. Privileges, especially those of the great aristocrats, were abolished. And the King and Queen of France were overthrown, imprisoned, and beheaded. An army of French citizens, inspired by revolutionary ideals, defeated professional armies sent against them by the monarchs of Europe. As the revolution swept on, it began to devour its leaders in a bloody reign of terror. Finally, after 10 years, it ended in the dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte. But the revolution was a turning point in Western history, with echoes that can still be heard today. To understand how and why the revolution came about, we need to look more closely at French society in the 1780s.
At that time, the people of France were divided by law into 3 estates. Each estate included members of all social and economic classes. The first estate consisted of the clergy, from the richest bishop to the poorest parish priest. The second estate was made up of the nobility. Although many nobles were wealthy, most were not. These nobles sought laws to restrict the highest positions in society to the nobility. They bitterly resented the king for selling key positions in the army, the church, and other social institutions to wealthy commoners. The third estate included everyone else, about 98% of the population. Here were wealthy merchants, doctors, artisans, shopkeepers, laborers, and most of all, peasants. At the bottom of the social scale, the peasants made up 85% of the population.
The peasants surrendered about 70% of their income to the tax collector to support the privileged classes. Their chief desire was to reduce this burden. Most members of the middle class, or bourgeoisie, about 13% of the population, had originally come from peasant backgrounds.
The lower middle class, or petite bourgeoisie, consisted of businessmen, traders, and shopkeepers. artisans and skilled workers, and members of the professions, doctors, lawyers, journalists, and some clergy. The businessmen and traders wanted economic freedom. Freedom to invest their money for personal gain without the taxes and controls imposed by the king and local aristocrats. Skilled workers and artisans wanted freedom from the capitalist financiers who increasingly controlled their trades and their wages. Members of the professions, especially lawyers and journalists, supported the new ideas of freedom and equality for the individual.
The upper middle class, or haute bourgeoisie, the wealthy landowners, civil servants, and financiers who controlled most of the country's banking, commerce, and industry, also advocated individual freedom. This class resented the aristocracy and clergy and sought to replace privilege based on birth with privilege based on merit or wealth.
The clergy made up less than 1% of the population, but possessed enormous privileges, from large landholdings to freedom from most taxes, including the tax on land. A few churchmen were wealthy and powerful. But most clergymen were either poor or middle class. Unable to advance to the highest church offices, some of them were outspoken opponents of privilege and power.
The nobility, 2% of the population, generally felt it beneath their dignity to engage in capitalist enterprise. In fact, many of them were prohibited by law from doing so. Consequently, they often lived in genteel poverty. The lives of the wealthiest, consisting of about 200 families, were centered on the king and the court. They lived in luxury and ease, exempt from many royal taxes, and automatically granted the most prestigious and financially rewarding government offices. These aristocrats had the most to lose if the king, Louis XVI, and his advisers bowed to the mounting pressure to curtail their privileges and their power.
In 1788, on the eve of the Revolution, the nobles were urging the king not to allow any change that would weaken their position. At the same time, more and more people, including many nobles, were becoming aware of the need for change. Influenced in part by an intellectual movement among 18th century writers whose ideas became known as the Enlightenment. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wanted to abolish privilege and social classes, arguing that all men are born equal, with equal rights. The satirist and critic Voltaire did not go so far. He thought that all men have natural rights that should not be abused by the privileged few, but believed in an enlightened monarchy. Montesquieu, a lawyer and a philosopher, thought that government should be a contract between king and people, with obligations on both sides. Many of these ideas found expression in the American Revolution and its Declaration of Independence, which upheld the democratic rights of the individual citizen. The French monarchy had invested large sums of money to support the American colonists against the British, not expecting that ideas stirred up in America would soon come home.
The French Revolution began as a conflict between Louis XVI and the aristocracy over money. France had experienced a great population increase during the 18th century. Then, in 1787 and 1788, poor harvests created famine, which brought large-scale unrest. To make matters worse, no money was available from the royal treasury to purchase food from abroad. The treasury was empty, partly from extravagant court expenditures. But the main reason was the long-standing and costly rivalry with Great Britain, which had led the French government to go heavily into debt to support the American Revolution. Jacques Necker and other of Louis's finance ministers proposed to abolish many social and economic privileges and to compel all classes to pay more equitable taxes. But the privileged insisted that changes in the system of taxation could be voted only by an assembly of the entire nation. Louis XVI, well-intentioned but weak-willed and lacking in energy, hesitated to assert the power of the throne. Both the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie clamored for a meeting of the Estates General, an official assembly representing all three estates.
On May 5, 1789, amid great popular excitement, the Estates General gathered at Versailles for its first meeting in 175 years. Immediately, a struggle developed over voting. Each estate had traditionally cast one block vote, enabling the clergy and the nobility to outvote the Third Estate by 2 to 1. The aristocracy had counted on this arrangement to vote down the new taxes. But the Third Estate now demanded that each representative have a separate vote. Citizens were besieged with pamphlets on the issue. In one, the Abbé Sieyès wrote,
"What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been before? Nothing. What does it demand? To become something."
On June 17th, the 600 members of the Third Estate declared themselves a National Assembly. They were joined by poor parish priests and a few other members of the First and Second Estates. On June 20th, locked out of their meeting hall, they adjourned to an indoor tennis court nearby and swore,
"Never to separate until the Constitution of the kingdom is established."
On June 23rd, the king seemed to agree to accept the National Assembly. The revolution had passed from aristocratic to bourgeois control. The king, meanwhile, gathered his troops.
By July 1789, violence was in the air. Royal troops were massing at Versailles and in Paris, where people rampaged through the streets, fearful that the king would somehow undermine the revolution. On July 14th, Paris mobs attacked and overwhelmed the Bastille, an ancient prison fortress and symbol of royal tyranny. 3 days later, the king, hoping to diffuse the violence and gain control of the revolution, dispersed his troops and arrived in Paris, where he appeared before crowds wearing the revolutionary tricolor. But the king's appearance had the opposite effect. Violence and chaos now swept across France in what is known as the Great Fear. Aristocrats' houses and estates were looted and burned by peasants who hoped to destroy records of feudal taxes owed to landlords. Officials of the old order were driven from office or killed, while representatives of the bourgeoisie took control. At the same time, fearful that the king might strike back by summoning a foreign invasion, the people seized arms and ammunition.
At Versailles, where the National Assembly continued to meet, the revolution also went forward. On the evening of August 4th, in a mood bordering on hysteria, nobles and clergy renounced their traditional privileges. The old feudal order was crumbling. On August 26th, the Assembly adopted a Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The Declaration affirmed that
Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. The rights of liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression.
not long after, all church property was nationalized, and paper money called assignat was issued with church lands as backing. In addition, the king was forbidden to make laws. Thoroughly alarmed, Louis XVI at first refused to approve these reforms. Tension mounted as he again surrounded Versailles with troops.
On October 1st, 1789, an army banquet was held at Versailles, with Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette in attendance. Amid much drunkenness, officers insulted the revolution and sang royalist songs. When news of the event reached Paris, angry crowds gathered and began to set up barricades. For the second time, but not the last, Paris mobs seized control of the revolution. On October 5th, a great crowd of women from the poorer quarters of Paris, furious that counter-revolutionaries held banquets while they went hungry, gathered to protest against the high price and shortage of bread. Then they set out for Versailles to present their grievances to the king. After breaking into the palace, they forced the royal family to return with them to Paris. An account of the return trip reported,
They carried the heads of 2 luckless members of the bodyguard and accompanied these ghastly trophies with hideous songs.
The National Assembly soon followed the king to Paris, but not before many monarchist members resigned and fled abroad rather than face the city's mobs.
As each day passed, the course of the revolution was increasingly influenced by the citizens of Paris, who tended to be more radical and more politically active than people in other parts of France. Most radical of all were the sans-culottes, so called because they generally wore trousers rather than knee breeches or culottes. Mostly shopkeepers and artisans, the sans-culottes dominated local government in Paris and put great pressure on the more cautious National Assembly, many of whose members were wealthy bourgeoisie. Paris was also a center for radical journalists and propagandists. Newspapers and magazines flourished, some even daring to suggest an end to the monarchy and the establishment of a republic. Political clubs and societies multiplied. Although the revolutionary movement was broad, it tended to split into warring factions. One of the more radical groups, the Jacobin Club, met in this former convent.
The early part of 1790 saw the National Assembly hard at work, passing still more reform measures and trying to frame a constitution. In the Assembly, radical groups known as Jacobins and Girondists sat to the left of the Speaker, moderate constitutional monarchists in the center, and nobles to the right. The political terminology of left for radical, center for moderate, and right for conservative originated with the seating in this assembly. The largely bourgeois members directed much of their attack against the First and Second Estates. Religious orders were suppressed and their property confiscated, while the titles of the nobles were abolished. The Assembly's most controversial measure was the civil constitution of the clergy. It required priests to swear their first loyalty to the French state rather than to the Pope in Rome. This measure was bitterly divisive in the strongly Catholic country.
But most of the French seemed to welcome what was happening. Their feelings were expressed in a huge festival held in Paris on July 14, 1790, the first anniversary of the fall of the Bastille. The English poet Wordsworth summed up the broad European sense of unity and enthusiasm.
Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven.
However, the following year saw mounting unrest and constant plots and intrigues, with the king and queen themselves often joining in. Finally, in June 1791, members of the royal family disguised themselves and attempted to escape from France. At the small town of Varennes, they were arrested after the king was recognized along the way by the man in charge of one of the posting stations. Upon their return to Paris, they faced an angry populace. Demands for a republic mounted. On July 17th, a huge crowd assembled on the Champ de Mars and called for an end to monarchy. To contain the mob, a troop of National Guards, commanded by Lafayette, was sent by the National Assembly. Tempers flared, the troops fired, and 50 people lay dead. The citizens of Paris were now pitted against both king and National Assembly.
In the autumn of 1791, the Assembly finally presented the nation with a new constitution. The king, whose limited powers had been suspended until he agreed to sign it, gave in. Elections were held for a new legislative body. This constitution expressed the aspirations of the bourgeois revolution. Qualifications for voting and holding political office were based on property ownership and wealth rather than birth. Noble and clerical privileges were abolished, free speech was guaranteed, and the powers of the king were defined by law. But to people in the Paris streets and clubs, the Constitution was a betrayal of 1789 and of the rights of man. They accused the Assembly of creating a new aristocracy of wealth. Meanwhile, many nobles and clergy, as caricatured in this revolutionary cartoon, were fleeing with as much wealth as they could carry, leaving France for countries where kings and aristocrats were still in control. The rulers of Austria and Prussia had already declared that they and their fellow monarchs would take up arms against France if Louis XVI's position were seriously threatened. As for Louis, his fate was suspended between those plotting to overthrow the revolution and those who hoped to get rid of the monarchy. In a children's game of the period called The Game of the French Revolution, players advanced around a board from the fall of the Bastille in 1789 to Louis XVI's acceptance of the Constitution of 1791. Here, many felt the revolution had ended. But the Constitution of 1791, while it realized many of the aims of the wealthier bourgeoisie, left other groups unsatisfied. A peasant committee explained,
We thought that after the decrees suppressing the feudal regime, we should be as free in our property as in our persons. 2 years' experience has shown us that we are still slaves.
The workers and the poor of Paris were equally frustrated. Urged on by Jean-Paul Marat and other radical agitators, the Paris Sans-Culottes staged march after march, demanding the emancipation of the people and liberty or death. Prominent in the new Legislative Assembly were members of the Jacobin and Girondist factions, who wanted France to become a republic. When the royal family was brought back to Paris as prisoners after attempting flight in June 1791, Louis XVI and the French monarchy were doomed. Control of the revolution was now to pass from the well-to-do bourgeoisie to the workers and the poor.
In other parts of Europe, the reaction of the rich and powerful to the French Revolution had ranged from dismay to horror. French aristocrats and some priests who refused to swear allegiance to the state fled to Prussia, Austria, and the Austrian Netherlands, now Belgium, where they began raising armies to invade France and put down the revolution. All the different factions of the revolution united in a call for war, for a crusade against the crowned heads of Europe. Louvet, a Girondist deputy, declared,
France shall take to arms at once. We shall surround the palaces with bayonets, but into each lowly hut we shall bring a translation of the rights of man.
In April 1792, the Assembly declared war on Austria. Volunteers enlisted by the thousands. Everyone seemed enthusiastically in favor of war. The king, busy playing off one group of revolutionaries against another, hoped for an Austro-Prussian victory that would restore his authority. Lafayette, extremely ambitious, hoped to lead a French triumph and then to use his prestige to ensure a continuation of moderate constitutional monarchy, controlled by him. Dumouriez and other Girondist ministers thought that war could spark a general revolution in Europe. Finally, radicals, such as Marat, thought that the strains of war would hasten the downfall of the monarchy in France.
At first, the French armies suffered defeats, and some French towns were besieged. Revolutionary fervor could not make up for lack of arms and training. Then the sans-culottes were inflamed when the Duke of Brunswick, leader of the Austrian and Prussian armies, declared he would destroy Paris if any harm should come to the French king and queen. On June 20th, after breaking into the royal palace, the Tuileries, they cornered the king and forced him to put on a revolutionary cap. An eyewitness wrote,
"The appearance of the capital became hourly more turbulent. There could be heard the furious cries of a populace threatening insurrection unless the assembly pronounced the dethronement of the monarch."
While the Girondist leaders of the assembly hesitated, control passed out of their hands. On August 9th, mobs of sans-culottes took over the government of Paris. Next day, a mob invaded the Tuileries again, overwhelming and massacring the royal guards. The king was arrested, and a special convention was quickly elected to draw up a new and more radical constitution. Early in September, fearing counter-revolution, Paris mobs, urged on by Marat, massacred over 1,200 prisoners suspected of royalist sympathies. Revolutionary spirits were further heightened by a French victory against the Prussians, the first of a string of military successes. Meanwhile, Lafayette, defeated and powerless, fled from his army to be captured and imprisoned by the Austrians. On September 21st, the new convention met and decreed unanimously that royalty is abolished in France. It proclaimed year one of the Republic. In December, when evidence proved that he was a traitor to the revolution, Louis was put on trial. He defended himself with clumsy lies, and in January 1793, he was guillotined. As the executioner held up the severed head, the crowd shouted, "Long live the Republic!"
The new convention reflected the fact that the revolution was no longer controlled by the wealthier bourgeoisie. The nobles of the 1790 National Assembly had emigrated or were in prison. The bourgeois Girondists were still the largest group, but now sat on the right. Jacobins and their allies, known as the Mountain, sat on the left. A large number of unallied deputies, known as the Plain, occupied the middle. The new republic faced major problems. A peasant uprising in central France brought famine and economic chaos, and abroad there were military defeats. An extreme left-wing group, known as Les Enragés, began to pressure the Girondists by demanding total government control of the economy, an idea that terrified the bourgeoisie, while delighting the sans-culottes. The convention rejected this idea, but adopted another left-wing proposal, setting up a committee of public safety to find and punish anyone suspected of opposition to the revolution. At its head was one of the leading Jacobins in the convention, the highly respected lawyer Georges Danton.
The Girondists remained under attack from the left within the convention and the sans-culottes outside. When in June mob pressure led to the arrest of Girondist leaders, the Mountain became the dominant political force. Soon afterwards, Jean-Paul Marat, hero of the sans-culottes, was murdered as he sat in his bath by Charlotte Corday, a young Girondist supporter and the daughter of an impoverished noble family. Marat's murder roused the left to further action. In August, a decree conscripted all young French men into the army, the first mass mobilization of citizens on behalf of a national government. In October, Queen Marie Antoinette was guillotined. Around the same time, a provincial lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre replaced Danton as the dominant figure on the Committee of Public Safety.
The Committee of Public Safety, headed by Robespierre, now ruled France in the name of the Convention. Its rule became known as the Terror. A number of Girondist leaders were executed. Between the autumn of 1793 and the summer of 1794, over 3,000 executions took place in Paris and 14,000 in the provinces, most by guillotine. Robespierre's supporters maintained that the Terror was justified by the need to save a revolution that was threatened from all sides. Internal dissatisfaction had led to uprisings in 60 of France's departments, or administrative units. The armies of Prussia, Austria, Britain, Holland, and other European countries still threatened invasion. Louis Saint-Just, a colleague of Robespierre, wrote,
"Liberty must prevail at any price. We must rule by iron those who cannot be ruled by justice. We must punish not merely traitors, but the indifferent as well."
Robespierre agreed.
The government of the revolution is the despotism of liberty against tyranny. Must might be used only in order to protect crime?
The terror's momentum was described by the English writer William Hazlitt.
The whole of the country seemed one vast conflagration of revolt and vengeance. The shrieks of death blended with the yell of the assassin.
The sans-culottes had demanded a policy of terror as a weapon against royalists, priests, and Girondists. But by 1794, the terror was claiming victims from the mountain. Danton declared in the convention,
"Perhaps the terror once served a useful purpose, but it should not hurt innocent people. No one wants to see a person treated as a criminal just because he happens not to have enough revolutionary enthusiasm."
Shortly afterward, Danton himself was arrested, tried, and executed. The terror became increasingly difficult to justify as French victories reduced the threat of foreign invasion. In July, Robespierre was denounced as a dictator, arrested, and along with his supporters, quickly executed. The terror of the left was over. It had been started to protect the revolution from its aristocratic enemies, but it ended by persecuting its bourgeois and sans-culotte supporters. The people, who had come to identify democracy with terror, had ceased to support either.
With the fall of Robespierre, the revolution veered to the right. As Girondist supporters were released from prison, control in the convention was regained by wealthy bourgeoisie, supported by officers from the army. In the streets of Paris, gangs of right-wing middle-class youths, known as Muscadins, attacked Republican clubs and fought with sans-culottes. While throughout the provinces, left-wing sympathizers were massacred in a reaction known as the White Terror. Inflation and unemployment soared through the winter of 1794 and 1795. Bread was rationed, and the value of revolutionary banknotes, or assignats, plummeted. Some middle-class profiteers and speculators made fortunes. To the sans-culottes, the gap between rich and poor seemed almost as wide as before 1789. The poor of Paris made two final attempts, both unsuccessful, to turn the political tide. A mass demonstration held on April 1st, 1795, was easily broken up by the National Guardsmen and the Muscadins. On May 20th, a crowd of armed sans-culottes surrounded and invaded the convention, attempting to influence deputies through violence as in the past. The army restored order, putting the revolution beyond the reach of street politics. The left was now crushed.
But the moderate bourgeois government still had to deal with a royalist uprising in Paris in October 1795. A young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte played a key role in defeating these right-wing rebels. Meanwhile, the convention had concluded peace treaties with Prussia, Holland, and Spain. Internally and externally, the government was secure. A new constitution, restricting both dictatorship and democracy, dissolved the convention and established a 5-man directory and a 2-house legislature.
Under the directory, the values and style of the bourgeoisie dominated Paris life. The young Napoleon wrote,
pleasure and the arts have regained their sway in an astonishing fashion. Dances, theater, and women have become the great business of life. Ease, luxury, and good form have all returned. The memory of the terror is just a nightmare.
One of the directors, Boissy d'Anglas, expressed the ideals of bourgeois politics.
Absolute equality is a chimera. We must be ruled by the best citizens. You will find such men only among those who own some property and are thus attached to the laws which protect it. You must therefore guarantee the political rights of the well-to-do.
One of the few to oppose these ideas was the journalist François Babeuf, leader of a small group of revolutionary idealists known as the Society of Equals. Babeuf wrote,
"The revolution is not yet complete because all the good things of life are taken by the rich who rule as dictators, while the poor toil in misery like slaves and are considered of no account by the state."
In May 1797, Babeuf was arrested, taunted by Paris crowds on his way to jail, and later executed.
Despite the peace treaties of 1795, the French army was still looking for action. Now, not in wars of liberation, but in wars of conquest. Napoleon Bonaparte, the most popular young general in the country, promised his men
rich provinces, great cities, honor, glory, and wealth.
Napoleon's forces swept through northern Italy in 1796 and 1797, forcing the Austrians, who controlled the area, to conclude new peace treaties more favorable to France. Only Britain remained an active enemy. In the spring of 1798, Napoleon set out for Egypt with a vast expedition aimed at damaging British commerce and establishing a French base in the Middle East. French forces entered Cairo, but the French fleet was destroyed in a surprise attack by the British at Aboukir Bay. Napoleon was momentarily trapped in Egypt. Meanwhile, a new coalition led by Russia, Austria, and Britain began to inflict defeats on the French in Europe.
In France, the Directory was under attack from both Royalists and Jacobins as taxes increased and the economy slumped. An attempted coup by Royalists was put down, but only with the help of army units. The army was becoming more and more involved in politics. Throughout 1798 and 1799, Paris society was alive with rumors of plots and counterplots. The revolution was tottering, its direction lost.
The final blow was delivered by Napoleon, seen in this cartoon surveying the wreckage of the revolution. Returning to France in October 1799, he immediately entered into a plot to destroy the legislative councils and establish an all-powerful executive. On November 9, 1799, Napoleon and his backers staged a coup. France was now ruled by 3 executives called consuls, with Napoleon the dominant one. Less than 5 years later, Napoleon declared himself emperor, continuing to lead the French armies in 15 years of war across the face of Europe. When he was at last defeated, the monarchy was restored in the person of Louis XVI's brother, who became Louis XVIII.
Despite the dictatorship of Napoleon and the restoration of the monarchy, the French Revolution changed the world. Immediately, it aroused a widespread desire for an end to aristocratic privilege and the establishment of greater individual freedom. In France itself, the power of the nobles was ended. Many of their estates were divided among peasants and bourgeoisie. This helped to create the nation of small land-holding farmers that France has remained into the 20th century. Elsewhere in Europe, Napoleon overthrew the old rulers and replaced them with ones whose powers were defined by law. Napoleon's conquests encouraged an upsurge of liberalism based on the rights of man. In addition, they encouraged the rise of nationalism among the conquered peoples. These ideas were behind the revolutions that swept Europe in 1848, when, for the last time, kings and aristocrats triumphed over liberalism and nationalism.
The French Revolution replaced the aristocratic ideal of privilege based on birth with the middle-class ideal of legal equality and privilege based on talent, merit, and increasingly on money. The revolution also replaced the ideal of the absolute monarch, ruling by divine right, with the ideal of the absolute national state, which theoretically represents and demands the allegiance of all citizens. For most of the Middle Ages, until the 16th century, great free cities, safe behind their walls, vied for political power in Europe, with feudal kings and nobles whose wealth came from their vast landholdings. By the 16th and 17th centuries, however, improvements in artillery meant that walls could no longer ensure the safety of cities. At this time, a new and rising class of merchants allied themselves with the kings and nobles. With money supplied by the merchants, kings and nobles could hire large armies, equip them with the latest weapons, and extend their control over more and more territory. By the 18th century, the most powerful of Europe's kings had created national states in which capitalist enterprise was flourishing. The glittering royal courts were supported by new bureaucracies as well as by military might. The wealth, glory, and power of these absolute monarchs was most lavishly displayed at Versailles, where the King of France held court. Here, the wealthy elite could buy privileges, ranging from lucrative offices to exemption from taxation. Perhaps more than elsewhere in Europe, France's king and capitalists had come to ignore the medieval Christian idea of community, which held that the privileged had responsibility for those at the bottom of the social order. The great mass of people were poor, while laboring endlessly to support the privileged. This was true of peasants toiling in the fields, burdened with royal taxes, and of city artisans and workers, jammed into slums whose rents enriched middle-class landlords.
Suddenly, in 1789, a revolution began that lasted 10 years and shattered the established social order in France.
The First Estate consisted of the clergy, from the richest bishop to the poorest parish priest. The Second Estate was made up of the nobility. Although many nobles were wealthy, most were not. These nobles sought laws to restrict the highest positions in society to the nobility. They bitterly resented the king for selling key positions in the army, the church, and other social institutions to wealthy commoners. The Third Estate included everyone else, about 98% of the population. Here were wealthy merchants, doctors, artisans, shopkeepers, laborers, and most of all, peasants. At the bottom of the social scale, the peasants made up 85% of the population.
The peasants surrendered about 70% of their income to the tax collector to support the privileged classes. Their chief desire was to reduce this burden. Most members of the middle class, or bourgeoisie, about 13% of the population, had originally come from peasant backgrounds.
The lower middle class, or petite bourgeoisie, consisted of businessmen, traders, and shopkeepers, artisans and skilled workers, and members of the professions, doctors, lawyers, journalists, and some clergy. The businessmen and traders wanted economic freedom. Freedom to invest their money for personal gain without the taxes and controls imposed by the king and local aristocrats. Skilled workers and artisans wanted freedom from the capitalist financiers who increasingly controlled their trades and their wages. Members of the professions, especially lawyers and journalists, supported the new ideas of freedom and equality for the individual.
The upper middle class, or haute bourgeoisie, the wealthy landowners, civil servants, and financiers who controlled most of the country's banking, commerce, and industry, also advocated individual freedom. This class resented the aristocracy and clergy and sought to replace privilege based on birth with privilege based on merit or wealth.
The clergy made up less than 1% of the population, but possessed enormous privileges, from large landholdings to freedom from most taxes, including the tax on land. A few churchmen were wealthy.
First, a National Assembly met and refused to disperse until a constitution had been written. Then a mob overran one of the king's great prison fortresses and took control of Paris. Privileges, especially those of the great aristocrats, were abolished. And the King and Queen of France were overthrown, imprisoned, and beheaded. An army of French citizens, inspired by revolutionary ideals, defeated professional armies sent against them by the monarchs of Europe. As the revolution swept on, it began to devour its leaders in a bloody reign of terror. Finally, after 10 years, it ended in the dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte. But the revolution was a turning point in Western history, with echoes that can still be heard today. To understand how and why the revolution came about, we need to look more closely at French society in the 1780s.
At that time, the people of France were divided by law into 3 estates. Each estate included members of all social and economic classes,